The Washington Post editorial board made a stunning decision today that for the first time in 36 years, the Washington Post editorial board will not endorse a candidate for president.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. We started 90 days ago because it was 90 days to the election, and now it is 6 days until the election. This really seemed like a fun gag when we first started doing it. Gets less fun every day. But this is a show where we talk to smart people about what they think about this attention-sucking, crazy driving, historic, unprecedented, unpredictable. Oh, maybe I shouldn't use the word unpredictable, but this election. The smart person we're talking about today is Parker Malloy. She is the author, the editor, the founder of The Present Age, a Substack newsletter that is vital reading right now. Parker, before we get started, I wanted to congratulate you on the successful coinage of sane washing.
Thank you. It's been interesting. Like I didn't actually coin it. I think I just popularized it.
Okay,
which,
good.
you know,
Good to give credit where credit is due.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I just heard it online and I was like, that's a perfect term, and kind of just kept going with it. And yeah, I used it in an article for the New Republic, and then everyone was using it. So it's tied back to me, I guess.
I think I've workshopped this with you before. Like, my preference is to not tie together insanity and racism. And as a not sane person, like, I always get kind of upset when people call bigoted things crazy, because I know a lot of crazy people who aren't bigots, right?
Mhm.
But it does seem to work so well. I mean, in what you were describing with that, or what the term describes that you popularized, is the inability of news organizations to honestly convey what Trump sounds like when he talks.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
You explain it a little bit for those who haven't been introduced to the term sane washing.
Sure. So basically, sane washing is something that I also, which didn't catch on, I also called coherence bias. But basically, it's this idea that Donald Trump will say, because it almost always just applies to Donald Trump. Donald Trump will say something that is completely bonkers, completely off the wall. He'll be talking about Hannibal Lecter. He'll be talking about sharks getting electrocuted. He'll be going on a rant about windmills, and then the next day, when you look in the New York Times, it'll say like Trump delivered economic address, and where you're like, yeah, I guess the topic was the economy, but it doesn't really capture what he said and what he did. So that is kind of, that's sane washing. It's sanitizing what the Donald Trump that we all know exists for a broader consumption. And that's the thing. Like, we're the outliers. The fact that we're the type of people who know what Donald Trump says at his rallies. Like, most people are not as plugged in as us. And that's probably good for their mental health. But it's the job of journalists to show things as they are, and that, I think, sometimes is lacking. So yeah,
Sometimes, Parker, I think it is. I had this brief moment in 2016 where I thought, you know what? I think they're getting it. Like, there is a feeling that journalists are starting to recognize, which is that, oh no, we're not referees. We're not actually calling balls and strikes. We are, in fact, on a team. Like, and we will get run over if we just pretend to be referees, right? And that is, for instance, when you had the Washington Post adopt the slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness," which I never loved. It's a little dramatic to me, but I get it. Parker, How do you think the Washington Post is holding up to that slogan?
Oh, that is I think they're lacking a little bit. As we all know, last week the Washington Post decided not to endorse a candidate in the presidential race. Apparently, after their editorial board was set to endorse Kamala Harris, and that came at the urging of Post daddy Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos decided to step in, interfere, block the Post from making an endorsement, and then tried to explain it away as a way of like, we're getting back to our roots of not endorsing, which they point back to like the 60s or something like that. And then just the other day, Bezos wrote he wrote an opinion piece for the paper, which I don't think helped him very much, where he tried to, he essentially was like, yeah, so I'm a super rich dude who, you can think that I have my own agenda, or you could look at the facts. And it's just like, I think you have your own agenda. I think it's obvious. And I think that there have been instances where he's inserted himself into this paper, and I don't understand how any sort of news organization is supposed to report fearlessly while the owner of the paper has made it clear that he's willing to step in and he's willing to interfere with the process. And that goes for, earlier this year, he replaced I believe it was the executive editor with Will Lewis, who came from the Telegraph over in the UK, which is kind of a right-leaning newspaper. And so that in itself was kind of, he's a scandal plagued media executive as it is. He was involved, I guess, in some sort of way with the phone tapping scandal. So if the goal is to restore trust to journalism, as Bezos says it is, I don't think he's doing a very good job of it.
Yeah, that op-ed by Bezos, which let's just posit probably wasn't written by him, but also could have been, because it's terrible. But there's a key line which he says, like, us journalists, which is why I think maybe that's just something that literally didn't get past an editor.
He also uses we in it throughout. So I think that was a conscious choice.
Yeah, and Parker, I haven't been able yet to ask you, so what have you been thinking about? And maybe we should have a second part of this conversation where we stop talking about the Washington Post. But as someone who has written for the Washington Post a fair amount myself, my ex-husband worked there for a long time. It was my hometown paper for a long time. I, until yesterday, had a subscription for a long, long time. And it is indicative of the moment we're in that we have seen a failure of conscience, a failure of courage, a failure that is also a failure that is only visible because people have chosen to call it out, which I think is kind of the saddest part. Like, there are so many things that are, if the worst happens, there are going to be so many times where it's just the failure to do something is going to be the thing that harms people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that there's this idea that people are obeying in advance of a potential Trump administration, of trying to stay on Trump's good side by not endorsing in the race. The LA Times did the same thing last week. This week, USA Today announced that it wasn't going to endorse, which USA Today, you can't really cancel a subscription to that, because unless you're a hotel chain, you probably don't have one. I mean, it's kind of brutal. It's kind of brutal to watch all of this play out and then feel totally helpless. And I think that that's why it was actually heartening to see the story about how apparently 200,000 people canceled their Washington Post subscriptions. And will that make a dent in Jeff Bezos's fortune? No. but it shows that people see what he's doing as a breach of trust. His direct involvement in the paper, because there are all sorts of things he can do that won't raise the public's alarm, where he can influence the direction of the paper, like he did by hiring Will Lewis. That is him of trying to change the direction of the paper. But this was just kind of a step too far. And I thought it was good to see people, canceling it, in large numbers, even though I saw so many posts from journalists who say, don't do this, don't cancel. It's only hurting the journalists there. But what else are you supposed to do?
Full disclosure, I was one of those people saying that, to not do it. And I have good friends that work at the Post, and I stand beside like my advice to not do that, because it isn't going to necessarily hurt him. However, mass action gets attention. And if I had known the number of people that were going to do it, and I'm just saying I was wrong, but also when I saw that many people cancel their subscriptions in solidarity, I was like, you know what? Yes. Like, if you're swinging a club that big, I will bandwagon it. Totally. Like, because that gets attention. And also the way that boycotts work, because you say why you're not buying or subscribing, and then you say what would bring you back. And I think that would be a really valuable thing if people are thinking about doing this, is unsubscribe and then send a letter saying, this is why I unsubscribed. This is when or if I will subscribe. And it's turning into a Streisand effect, right? Like the story of unsubscriptions is going to continue to gain attention. But I also want to point out, not everyone can do every right thing to live a completely moral, good life. You do what you can. If you feel like you need your Washington Post subscription, I'm not gonna shame someone. Like there is, unfortunately, under capitalism, there is a lot you can do to resist. Like sometimes it's going to be a lot of small things. Do you know what I mean? Like, not everyone can do every right thing. You get to pick and choose your right things, but do some right things.
Yeah. When you can. And I think that's, kind of one thing about the cancellations that I thought was interesting is that, so in Bezos's opinion piece that he or someone in his circle wrote, he talked about the lack of trust that the public has in media, and that actions that he's been taking have been intended to restore trust. So blocking the endorsement was intended to restore trust in the media. Bringing in Will Lewis was intended to restore trust in the media. All of these things where essentially what he's saying is he's afraid that people don't trust the press. And the fear is that people on the right don't trust the press. So he has to do more to appease them. And that is the problem. That is what every single time one of these newspapers is like, we have to do more to restore trust in the media. And so they lurch to the right, and they start pulling punches. They start sane washing. They do these things to try to appease people who will never say that they're doing a great job. I mean, remember in 2020, Donald Trump was railing against Fox News for not being pro-Trump enough. He was telling people, turn off Fox, watch OAN, watch Newsmax instead. That was what Trump world was saying, because Fox would occasionally have like a Democrat on a panel or something like that. He still does that. He still says, why are they having these people on? And so I think it's good that maybe larger media organizations can see people who are not on the right, people who are in the middle, people who are on the left, also losing trust in the press, and realize they can't just move to the right to try to fix this problem, because they'll make the problem worse in other ways. And so that's why I think it's been really interesting to kind of see that. And that's why I'm all for loud, vocal criticism of the Washington Post, the New York Times, any of these outlets. I mean, because they're not perfect, and the journalists who work there get very angry when anyone left of center criticizes their work. They're like, "How dare you? How dare you? Oh, you're canceling? How dare you cancel?" This sort of there's a sense of entitlement that goes with it, but that's because it's baked in. It's assumed that people on the left will put up with anything. We'll just sit there and take what they're given and go, this is fine. No, I mean, people on the right constantly scream about the media, and they do it and they get things out of it. So what's the lesson there? It's like
Work the
people on the
refs.
left should also be vocal when they don't like something, when they don't like how something's covered. And sometimes those criticisms will be fair, and sometimes it won't be fair. And hopefully, what you have to hope for is that media outlets will look at the criticisms that are fair and go, okay, maybe we got to change a few things around here. Maybe we can't just, maybe our response to every election isn't, okay, what Wall Street Journal editorial writer can we bring into the New York Times to move us to the right, which is what happened after 2016, which is what happened after 2020. Because after 2016, the idea was, well, Donald Trump won the election, and that proves that we were out of touch and we need to understand the right better. So the New York Times brought in Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss. And then in 2020, even though Biden won the election, it was, well, Republicans are very upset, so we need to kind of shift to the right here. And so that keeps happening. There is never an election. There's no outcome that will cause a newspaper to shift to the left. So we keep moving to the right. We keep moving to the right. And it's just going to get worse. And so, yeah, I think it's good that we're finally at a point where people are speaking up in response and pushing back on this, because in the outlets that we're supposed to have, the idea of having a public editor, having, someone at the paper that complaints can be directed to, where they will get heard and responded to, those have all been taken away. And at the time, the New York Times said, yes, we're going to get rid of this because social media is there and social media can act as our public editor. But then when people speak up on social media, you hear executives and reporters being like, how dare they? How dare the peasants speak up? That sort of idea.
So I do need to ask you the usual opening question.
Sure. We're getting around to it, 20 minutes in.
So, Parker, there's a lot to talk about, but election-wise, what are you thinking right now, today, 6 days out?
6 days.
What is top of mind?
Honestly, I'm a little worried about the fact that
Sorry.
I'm just a tiny bit worried. I think that's maybe reasonable. But specifically, I'm worried that if this election does go to Donald Trump, that if Republicans win, given that their kind of closing message for the past few weeks has been nonstop anti-trans attacks, that the lesson that Democrats will take away from this is that they need to be more anti-trans. And I feel like that is not a good lesson. And that would be a very bad lesson for trans people. But it would be consistent with how, the Labour Party in the UK moved. They moved far to the right on trans issues. And now there's no major party over there that defends trans rights. It's just getting worse and worse. So I'm worried that if Trump pulls this off, that people aren't going to look at the many flaws of the campaign, the fact that the Harris campaign was a short short campaign that didn't have a lot of time, didn't have a lot of a chance to build its own infrastructure. There are all sorts of reasons that Harris may lose. But I don't think it'll be because of trans people. However, I do think that trans people will get blamed. And that's something that happened. It happened in 2016. There was this guy who wrote for the New York Times named Mark Lilla, who wrote a piece about why Hillary Clinton lost. And one of the things that he listed was that he said that Hillary Clinton spent too much time talking about transgender bathrooms. She did not talk about that issue at all during her campaign. The only people who were talking about that issue were Republicans. Just like this year, the only people who are talking about trans issues is Republicans. If anything, the Democrats are afraid to outright, acknowledge that trans issues are at stake. You'll have occasionally you'll get like maybe a nice quote from like Tim Walz, just being like, yeah, it's kind of bad that they're targeting this tiny group. But the Harris campaign itself has been silent on trans issues, this entire campaign. So I'm worried that trans people will be the scapegoats. So that's my concern.
I understand why that might be top of mind.
Little bit,
Again, I admire your ability to stay relatively calm in explaining that, to be honest. It is the kind of existential threat that sometimes I get emotional talking about reproductive health, which trans rights are actually kind of also in the genre of reproductive health. And the Democrats found a spine to talk more openly about the specifically like having pregnancy part of reproductive justice. If they could just just open that up a little bit, just like see that this is a spectrum that includes a lot of bodily autonomy issues, right? And that you can talk just as openly about those things, or you should talk just as openly about those things rather than kind of like, I feel like right now the Democrats, to put the best face on it possible, are doing with trans rights what they used to do with abortion rights, which was the whole like safe, legal, and rare kind of talk. Like, like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And it's the same stakes. It's the same people will die stakes.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. What I think a lot of people maybe don't understand is that these are tied together. The argument that's being used in courts right now to argue against protections for trans people is the Dobbs decision. That's being used to argue against trans rights because it's saying basically, well, no, I mean, maybe states do have a right to interfere in people's healthcare decisions. And, that's what I hope that more people will realize that as trans rights get chipped away, that other rights will get chipped away too, because these things, they don't exist in a vacuum. And, it is an issue of bodily autonomy. And I think that that's something that sometimes just isn't understood. You have people freaking out about, they're like, oh, I don't want prisoners to have health care. Well, I mean, those are those ads that are everywhere, which as someone who likes to watch some baseball and football from time to time, has been not fun to be like, I'm just going to kick back and relax, turn on the game, and watch myself get dehumanized every commercial break. That hasn't been a lot of fun. But these ads will argue. They'll say Kamala Harris wants to give sex changes to prisoners and stuff like that. But what's actually being argued there is that the Eighth Amendment doesn't apply to trans people. And it's not so much about surgeries. It's more about worrying about trans people being taken off their hormones if they go to jail. being forcibly medically detransitioned, which is a sort of body horror that is just terrifying. And because people will go, I don't want my money going for that. Well, there's a lot of stuff that tax dollars go to that I don't want. And even if you just look at medical care for people in prison. Harvey Weinstein just was diagnosed with cancer or something along those something bad that he deserves. And and it's like our tax dollars are paying to treat him. He has all the money. He could pay for it himself. But our tax dollars go to treat him because that's how the system works. And it works, and it's how it's supposed to work. And it's good that it works that way because it helps people who need care, who, when if you're sentenced to 1 year in jail, you're sentenced to 1 year in jail, not 1 year in jail, plus not having your health care taken care of, plus losing 5 years of your life off of that or something like that.
I always think our tax dollars are paying for arguments are really funny, especially coming from conservatives, because money is fungible. So if tax dollars pay for anything, they're paying for everything. Like if you allow people to get free education, you are also on some level paying for their transition, or they're paying for their, like, if you're paying for something that people use, then they get to use that money for something else. So when people argue shit like that, they're not saying my tax dollars. They are saying, I think that thing is immoral and I want people to not do it. It is not actually about a tax dollars argument. It is that we should not have that in our society. And I want to point out on the issue of paying for sex changes, you said this earlier. I think it's worth underlining what the law says is that people who are incarcerated get to have health care. They get to have the health care that they need. Right now, things like being able to access some gender affirming care is considered part of health care, right? Like, is just considered to be a thing like getting cancer treatment or whatever. So to say they can't get it would actually be against the law. And it is also true that when Harris and Wells have said anything on this issue, they have said, I will follow the law. That is like the little gotcha that the Republicans think that they have is, is the phrase, we will obey the law, which is,
it's not as
sad
though
on both sides a little bit.
It's not as though Harris is some big champion of trans rights. I mean, she's just not. And,
No.
I mean, is she a million times better than Donald Trump? Absolutely. Is she in line with other Democrats? Yeah. But Democrats as a whole aren't like big champions of trans rights. If anything, it's their argument is we're not going to harm you, and maybe we'll do things to try to make it a little easier for you to live, which is great. I mean, that should be the job of a government, to not make your life materially worse and to maybe make it a little better, And I think that like, if Democrats were as pro-trans as Republicans make them out to be, I would be ecstatic.
If they were as socialist as they make them out to be, like if they were really out there giving shit away to people that people need, I'd be excited.
Republicans
I want to
make
underscore
Democrats
another
look
thing.
so cool.
Yeah, I know. I've said 1,000 times, and we wouldn't be having these problems in journalism if we had robust social safety net, because more people would enter journalism, and also you wouldn't have to keep your job in order to get healthcare. Like right now, when I say I'm reluctant to cancel my subscription to the Post because I know people who work there. If I knew they were going to get healthcare no matter what, I'd be cancel it, baby. Just go right ahead. But about the inevitable post-election autopsies, your point that you think trans people might be blamed or scapegoated should Trump win, I think two things. One is I want to get ahead of that now, as you are, by saying, to say that Kamala Harris would lose because of her, the successful prosecution of the culture war among trans people, would make as much sense as saying Kamala Harris lost because she didn't invoke Hannibal Lecter enough, right? Like, it just because somebody wins, it doesn't make it a good argument. And also, when the number of people in the country who might be moved on this issue, it's probably pretty small. In fact, it's also going against other evidence we have of attacking trans rights as being unsuccessful in many elections, right? So it's just kind of already not true that this is working. They're just trying to make it seem like it works.
I've actually got some data I can point to that I happen to have written up in my notepad right
Please,
here.
do you have a visual effect? We're on YouTube. You want to bring up a notebook?
I do not. However, I can tell you that there's recent polling from Data for Progress, which showed that 57% of likely voters are more likely to vote for a candidate who says that the government should stay out of people's private lives and that there's too much legislation targeting trans people. While just 34% said that they're more likely to support a candidate who says that we need new laws to restrict access to transgender healthcare and to keep trans girls out of girls' sports. So right there's a big split. And what there's an even bigger split on is the focus that trans issues get. Because the split on that is Republicans tend to say, yes, we should support candidates who want to restrict care, and independents and Democrats tend to say no. That's how you end up with 57 versus 34. But when asked the question of whether politicians should spend less time talking about trans issues and more time talking about things like the economy and inflation, 80% of voters agreed, including 85% of Republicans. Funnily, as funny as it is, 75% of Democrats agreed. And I think that that's because they probably think that we should talk more about trans issues in a positive way, hopefully. But 85% of Republicans think like there's too much focus on trans issues, but that's their closing message. And, if they win, it'll be despite this, not because of this.
I agree. I totally agree. And, I would like Colin Allred to win. I want to be very clear. In my ideal world, he also would be not as much of a coward on the trans issue. However, I think that his response to Cruz on this was really good. Ted Cruz cares about what happens in children's bathrooms. I care what happens to women in emergency rooms.
Yeah, perfect.
I don't like his denials of caring about trans people are bad. But that particular argument, I think, is one that Democrats could make every day if they wanted to, right? If you really just don't want to take a forward position on the trans issue, which you and I agree they should take a forward position on the trans issue, you can just keep pointing out this is fake. This is a fake amount of care given to young people, given the number of young people who, young meaning both below the age of 30 and young being below the age of 10, right? Like, you don't really care. If this is what you're focusing on, you don't really care about people living and dying.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So,
I mean, the big surge in anti-trans stuff happened, as it concerns sports, happened in 2020. You had states where all the schools were closed. No one was playing sports, but like the state legislature would come back and do a special session where they would be like, we need to ban trans people from competing in sports that aren't happening right now. Like that's it. It's done to appease their base. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to watch.
I would say it's not even done to appease their base. I think it's actually done simply to excite the base. It's one of those things where there's probably a lot of of Republicans right now who 3 years ago could not have found trans healthcare on a map. I don't know quite the right metaphor, but like it was off their radar. Like if you asked them about it, they probably had opinions, but if you quizzed them going into the voting booth, it wouldn't have been something that came up, right? Now, it is like critical race theory been a thing that the right has willed into existence as a moral panic, and they are benefiting from it not more with the media than with voters. And this is the second point I wanted to make about these post-race autopsies that are going to happen, because I think this is a point that you and other trans writers have made, which is no matter who wins, if this isn't called out now and talked about now and pushed back forcefully now, there are people, both parents, children, folks on the street, for whom this kind of talk is normalized. And especially when I think of, and maybe it's you that made this point, and I'm sorry if I'm not crediting you directly right now, but like if you're a child right now watching the World Series and you maybe think you might be trans, what does that feel like?
Yeah. It's crushing. I mean, it reminds me of when I was a kid, and every mention of trans people that I ever saw was either Ace Ventura. It was someone who was the villain of the movie who was played for laughs, or it was Jerry Springer, or or some show like that. And I remember just being really sad about that, because it's like, these are people being laughed at. These are people being treated horribly. You had, Jim Carrey's character in that movie. He's throwing up because he found a trans woman attractive, even though the actress herself was not trans, obviously. But it's something where I thought we were past that. I had hoped that we were past that, where it was just like, okay, trans people exist. Some people are trans. Most people are not. That's cool. Like, I had hoped that we were there, but in about 2016, things started to turn. And I think that when Trump won, it sent a message that everything that was going on in culture was, there was a big shift after he won, where it's, well, I guess that racism is okay. I guess that transphobia is okay. I guess that homophobia is okay. These sorts of ideas started to get put back out there. And it did come from the media, just generally. It was a lack of pushback on this, because there was this idea that if millions of people all voted for Donald Trump, then that must mean that they believe all of the horrible things he says and does. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But remember after the Access Hollywood tape, how you had the social media account for Tic Tacs put out a statement saying Tic Tacs does not believe in like this. You that is not something that companies would do today.
Yeah.
I don't think that the companies would go, oh, we got to distance ourselves from this, because they'd be afraid of upsetting Trump and his supporters. But at the time, it was like there were companies willing to be like, we're going to speak out against this thing that was just said. There was a time where Donald Trump Jr. during the 2016 campaign compared refugees to a poison bowl of Skittles.
And Skittles came back at him.
Skittles came back and was just like, refugees are human beings and Skittles are candy, And I don't think that they would do that today. I think there's this fear of crossing Donald Trump and crossing his supporters, doing anything that might upset them, that just permeates society. And it doesn't go both ways. You can't offend a Trump supporter, but Trump supporters are supposed to be able to say that the city that you live in is a hellhole and is falling apart and everything is horrible and all the people there are terrible. But if if a single Democrat talked about Kansas the way that Republicans talk about California, like
Yeah.
the press would be like out of its mind.
We've hit on something that I want people who listen to the show or watch the show to really take home, which is what happens if the worst doesn't happen, right? And what battles are left to be fought. Because I think while Trump winning and the reaction of the media and the left being, oh, I guess we went too far on cultural issues, is truly, that's a worst case scenario. There is a scenario that's not much better, where the sigh of relief after Harris wins just blows every other concern away. And we can talk about this specifically in terms of trans rights, or trans issues, or reproductive issues, or bodily autonomy issues writ large. But when it comes to trans folks in particular, what I think about is the pushback that needs to happen to those ads, even if Harris wins, right? And the amount of talk that needs to be had in homes, on TV, on editorial pages, in news pages about this, that needs to kind of try to undo some of that psychological and narrative damage that those ads have done, and all that talk has done. Because if we just blow past this moment and be like, "Oof, got away with it," you know what? Hey, Parker, aren't you glad Harris won? They did all those attacks on trans people, and then she won anyway. So, guess we're good.
Yeah. I guess we don't have to. I guess we don't have to stand up to this. We don't have to push back because we can win anyway. Yeah. I think that's a real fear. And I mean, I think that after 2020, that sort of happened. People were so relieved that Trump didn't win that it was just kind of autopilot. That was just, whew, he's out, he's done. When Republicans lose, they don't ever go, "What did we do wrong? We have to." No, and there weren't pieces.
Trump didn't rejigger his whole campaign. This is actually kind of a funny thought experiment to do. Like, if Trump had reacted to his loss in 2020 the way that Democrats react to their losses, where he's like, all right, back to the drawing board. Like, I guess attacks on immigrants didn't work. What are we going to do this time?
Yeah. And I mean, and I mean, after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, that was kind of the advice that they sort of came up with. They're like, maybe we need to be less bigoted. And then they nominated Donald Trump. But now that doesn't happen. Republicans just say, no, Trump actually won. They don't go, here's what he did wrong in his campaign. You won't find anyone criticize Trump's 2020 campaign on the right. They'll say he did it perfectly because he won the election in a landslide. They'll say that. And that's one thing we can be sure of. No matter what happens, Donald Trump is going to insist that he won. And he's going to insist that not only that, but he won in a landslide, which is goofy because no one's going to win in a landslide. It's going to be close.
Popular vote wise, I'm still urging people to go out and vote no matter where they are, and then run up the totals in red and blue states. And I do think it could be a landslide in the popular vote. And that is my
I still think the funniest possible outcome would be Harris winning the Electoral College but losing the popular vote. That's how we get rid of the Electoral College.
When you say funny, Parker.
Yeah, funny, haha.
I just want to. I guess you mean kind of like funny, strange.
Yeah, just a little chaos grenade toss in there. See what happens.
Let's talk about this pushback. Okay, nice, not hilarious scenario. Best case scenario: Harris wins, landslide, popular vote, and just wins electoral vote. Aside from having sort of a sense of relief day, that the day that she actually gets inaugurated, we won't say election day, whatever. On this front of what battles should we still be fighting, and you can speak specifically to trans issues if you like, although there's a bunch of other ones. Like, what do you want to see from people on the left, and maybe specifically media, but also politicians, if Harris wins?
Sure. I mean, I would like to see. I would in media, I would like to see trans people included in conversations more. because that's something that doesn't happen right now, and that I think that most media outlets should kind of hang their head in shame over the fact that trans people are under attack nonstop, and that there aren't trans people being given voices in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. The only trans person who's regularly on cable news is Caitlyn Jenner on Fox News, where she argues the anti-trans side of things, um, which is kind of her job there. So that's one thing. I think that there needs to be more inclusion of trans people in discussions. But one thing I would like to see, on the left more generally, is just an understanding that that if you allow one group to get thrown under the bus, it's going to hurt everyone. Or if not everyone, it's going to hurt a much larger group. If you throw trans people under the bus, if you don't protect trans people, it's going to hurt reproductive rights as a whole. If there's a Supreme Court case that's going to be heard in, I think it's December, where it's about whether it's legal for a state to impose bans on trans youth's healthcare. And depending on how the court rules in that case, it might open the door to states banning trans adults' healthcare. And it might open the door to states having the power to ban any medicine they don't like. That could be birth control. That could be the morning after pill. Like all of these things are connected. And that's the thing I want people to understand, is that these things are connected, and you can't just write off a group because you maybe don't understand that group, or because you go, this group is 1% of the population, we don't have to care about them. Because I think that's what happens a lot of the time now. There's this idea that trans people make up a very small percent of the population, and therefore you can ignore them. You can ignore trans rights, while you can't ignore abortion because that affects half the population. So like, I think that that kind of explains why Democrats found a spine on one but not the other. And hopefully we can get to the point where the way that they're talking about abortion now, where maybe they're still not super comfortable talking about this, because clearly some Democrats are not. But if they could bring that same energy to talk about trans issues, that would be a major step forward, because that would at least be countering the right-wing attacks. Because so far, what we've seen is there are nonstop right-wing attacks. Democrats then do nothing in response. And then sometimes the attacks work, sometimes the attacks don't. But because Democrats are not fighting back, it's just either staying the same or getting worse every time. So we can't keep doing that. We can't keep letting the rights of people get chipped away without someone fighting back.
I think I want to start to draw things to a close, but because I know the type of people who watch or listen to the show are the type of people who want to not just be consuming this content, but I'm pretty sure at this point we all have nervous energy we want to make use of. If you have yet to cancel your Washington Post subscription, you could do that. And also, when you write your letter about why, you could say there aren't enough trans people covering issues at your paper. And you could start to consume media that has been produced by trans people. Parker, there is your newsletter. What else would you recommend if people wanted to start supporting trans creators?
There is another really great newsletter that I read. It's by Erin Reed. It's called Erin in the Morning. She's just phenomenal. That would be my number one recommendation, that people go check that out, because she writes exclusively about trans issues, and she dives into this topic in a way that would be so bad for my mental health. that like, I've been there. I have been the one diving into these topics at that level, and I got burnt out. but she does such a great job covering trans issues. I want to recommend that people go check that out. I think it's just erinninthemorning.com.
What about Assigned Media? I like
Assigned Media is another great one.
Yeah.
That one's run by Evan Urquhart, he's a trans man, and he similarly does a great job covering trans issues. So those are the two that I would really recommend people.
And there's
check
Charlotte
out.
Clymer, friend of the pod, who also does a Substack newsletter.
Yeah, oh yeah,
and
she
there's
has a
tons of
Substack.
others out there. If you start my experience with wanting to expand the kinds of voices that I consume is that once you start with one or two, three good ones, you just follow their links, and you're going to get to a bunch of others. All right. This has been really wonderful talking to you, Parker. I always enjoy it. You're such you bring so much knowledge and heart to everything you talk about, and I really admire and respect that. And thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time to talk with me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk with you.
All right. This has been, where is it? 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. 6 days to the election. Vote, 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 vote. That's just an exclamation point after each, not an encouragement to vote several times. Although, I don't know. You can give it a shot. I guess they're saying it's happening. And I'm kidding. That's totally a joke. This is available as a podcast where you get your podcasts. Available on YouTube, where you get your YouTubes. Please rate, review, etc. We will be going on with this show for as long as we are deciding who the president is, which means we'll start into negative numbers in 7 days. Parker, until then.
I wouldn't be the first person in Congress to be part of a community that Donald Trump has said outrageous things about.
There are members of Congress who have repeatedly railed against trans people. How are you going to make peace with them?
I think the ones who are really caught up on this, the folks who are those professional provocateurs, they're not going to work with any Democrat. They can barely work with their own Republican colleagues.